I'll be talking today not so much about routing security per se, but what it really means for enterprises and how I think the enterprise should look at this phenomena. All right, so what is routing security? What is the problem? I hope you all know what it is. It's basically because routing security is still largely based on trust. The networks, how they build their own roadmap in the internet, they exchange reachability information about networks they know they connect to, and other networks accept this information and spread it further among other networks. And that's how routing works in the internet. So each network builds its own roadmap. Unfortunately, the BGP, the protocol that is used to exchange this information, is not secure in a way that network has to validate this information before accepting or passing this to other networks. Unfortunately, many of the networks are still not doing this because it strictly doesn't require for the operations. You can still build a roadmap if you don't care how accurate it is. So what it leads to some distortions that if information you receive from other networks are false, then your roadmap is not correct. Your network, your peer may pretend that they're Google while they're not Google, for instance, and you will send all the traffic to them while the traffic should be destined to another network. So that caused a lot of problems in the internet. Now, we know about this problem for, let's say, 3 decades and still struggling, and still this problem is not resolved. And why is it so hard? Well, the thing is that it takes all of the networks, and there are about 76,000 networks in the internet, autonomous systems in routing terms that operate there. So for all of them to do something that is not strictly required for the operations is very difficult, right? Besides, there is quite a weak business case, because if you introduce these routing controls in your network, it costs you money, it costs you resources, right? But the benefit, it doesn't secure you completely. Still, security of your network is very much in the hands of other network operators. And that's what we call the collective action problem. It's another name, a tragedy of the commons, where we all understand that we need to do something, right, to have a better, more secure environment, and that will reduce our costs and reduce number of incidents that we experience. But it's a problem of individual actions leading to collective action. So this problem in many other areas is solved by regulation. Unfortunately, regulation doesn't work as well in the internet because the internet is global and regulatory approaches are national, right? So if you regulate in one country, a network in another country can raise havoc in the internet by introducing these routing security problems. It leads to fragmentation as well, and it's too rigid to follow the technology development. So more promising approach, and that's a general approach, is to establish norms, right? That's also in our society how we operate. We establish certain norms, right? And we sort of commit to those norms as a society. Well, the same, we try to do this approach with what we call mutually agreed norms for routing security. And it's based on 2 things, 2 pillars. One is the undisputed baseline, what we call the minimum security baseline that every network should implement. It's minimum because it's feasible for all the networks, but it's high enough to make a significant difference in routing security. And the second thing is building the community, building the networks that adhere to those norms and can demonstrate that they do this. So it's visibility and transparency of the effort that plays a role here. Now, this transparency is achieved by another tool that you can see if you go to this link on the slides. It's MANRS Observatory, where you can see the actual numbers, how networks perform on the internet, as far as routing security is concerned. Just to give you an example what this norm looks like. We launched first program more than 10 years ago, and it was for network operators. That's the main category of networks that operate on the internet. And there are 4 actions, what we call baseline is defined by actions. One is filtering, so please filter incorrect routing announcements. Please validate what you're accepting from your customers specifically. And do not propagate incorrect routing information further in the internet. Anti-spoofing, as you probably know, IP source address spoofing is a great source of amplification reflection attacks. So if networks can control what they're emitting in the internet and do not allow source IP address spoofing, that would greatly contribute to reduction of denial of service attacks in this area. Coordination seems a very simple thing, that you're reachable, your contact is reachable, but it's a crucial thing when you're trying to coordinate mitigation of an attack, for instance, further across the globe. And action 4 is what we call routing information. I mentioned that in BGP itself doesn't contain this validation thing, the sort of original BGP. And therefore, each network has to go and query other databases where this routing information intent is recorded in order to validate what they receive from their peers. And keeping this information up to date and current is very important. Unfortunately, it's not done fully, and that's why this action is here. There are 2 registries, basic types of registries, that keep this information. One is Internet Routing Registries, and another one is RPKI system. That's a new technology, a very promising one. So that's what Action 4 talks about. Now, I said 10 years ago, we launched this Network Operators program, and then we followed with other 3 programs for IXPs, and that talks about the safe peering environment, internet exchange points. They require from their members that they do the filtering, and Internet Exchange Point also does the filtering for their members. So routing information exchange through the Internet Exchange Point is validated. That's very important. Content delivery networks and cloud providers, that was the 3rd program that we launched in 2020. And it was about everyone wants to peer with CDNs and clouds, right? And they have this peering power that allows them to say, hey, there are some norms that we would like you to adhere if you want to peer with us directly. And therefore, that also improves routing hygiene. It also motivates other networks to implement routing security controls. And lastly, but not least, in 2021, we launched the Network Equipment Vendor Program, which is very important because if your equipment doesn't support these features that controls that those actions specify, it's very difficult to implement them. So this is how the program grew over these years. It continues to grow, and now we're having more than 1,200 participants in all 4 programs. Continues to grow. That's the numbers from April 2025. So 10 years of community action. That's a short intro to the MANRS because that's the starting point for my real talk about the enterprise and routing security. It was started at the company called Internet Society in 2014, but in 2024, the secretariat function and all operations were transferred to Global Cyber Alliance, where I'm now working with. So I was with MANRS from the very beginning, and now I continue to work with MANRS in Global Cyber Alliance. Now, so I talked about this norms, right, and kind of this peer societal pressure of what is normal in routing operations. But business case is very important. Ultimately, we do something that contributes to the bottom line of the companies. And one of clear business case of implementing routing security control is protecting your own network, right? For instance, if you accept incorrect announcements from your customers, and that happened many, many times, your customer all of a sudden can become your peering or your transit provider. So for instance, all traffic directed to Google, instead of going to the great internet or to Google directly, will go to your customer. And of course, that will probably overload the customer, the whole infrastructure, and your infrastructure as well, and will create an outage, a multi-hour outage that happened many times. So protecting your own network is very important. By implementing those actions, you do this. That's a clear business case. Now, internet is global, right? So even if you protect your own customer code and your sort of infrastructure, that's not enough, right? Because incident can happen elsewhere in the internet. And it's very important that all of us, all the 76,000 networks, at least majority of them, are contributing to routing security. Because routing security is the sum of all contributions. No one is really safe until some of the networks are not doing their work. That sounds like a big, challenging step. Well, I would say it's not necessarily all 76,000, because 85% of all networks are edge networks that make less decisions in routing. And we are really talking about this 16–15% of the networks that really make routing decisions, the connectivity providers, the transit providers. And that's the entities I'll be talking today. But the third business case is getting competitive advantage. If you're good, if you implement routing controls, you surely be more attractive to your customers as a potential connectivity provider for them. And that is still challenging. So why is that? So if we talk about customers and their enterprise networks, organizations that not necessarily participate in sort of global routing, their service is not providing connectivity, but using connectivity to get to their assets, that's what I collectively call enterprise network. When they look at this picture, and this is the picture of all networks connected in the internet, 76,000. So each dot there represents this autonomous system. In routing terms, that's a name for the network, right? They look at this and they say, hey, how can my choices, how can they influence my security in this huge ecosystem, in this universe? Because there's so sort of levels of interaction, so many dependencies. How can I secure, how can I even ensure that my presence in this ecosystem is secure? The internet is too big. Well, yes and no. So if you look at the enterprise and you look where their digital assets are increasingly being stored, and they're increasingly being stored outside their perimeter, the internet for enterprises is not as big. So if you look at where they store their assets, cloud providers, hosting providers, CDNs, you will see that the distance between their network and the network of those providers is very short. It's probably one intermediary, if any. So in fact, if enterprise selects a reliable and high-quality connectivity provider, they can ensure that the path between them and their digital asset is secured. To prove this concept, we did some research. So what we did, we looked at the routing table, we looked at different sectors, and just to see how many intermediaries, how many other networks the traffic needs to pass before reaching destination. So one of the examples, we looked at Australian banking industry. So we looked at some of the companies in the banking sector of Australia, and we also looked at some of the potential providers where they can store their data, such as Akamai, such as Cloudflare, and others. And what appeared here, if you don't look at some of the DDoS providers like Prolexic, for instance, you will see there's one provider that connects them to their digital assets. So it's just one hop that you need to secure, not the whole internet. And by the way, the color scheme here, it's represent compliance of those providers to MANRS actions, 4 MANRS actions, remember I mentioned. So in principle, the blue they are, the better, right? You look for connectivity providers that blue, that implement all routing security controls. That means your traffic from A to B is really secured. Now, B2B relationships. We looked at automotive industry and picked up some of the auto vendors and their suppliers, global suppliers. And if you look here, well, you probably see more hops, 2 hops, which means if the the enterprise, the manufacturer, chooses their connectivity provider wisely, and so does their partner, their business partner. Again, their path is secured. So what does that mean? That means that routing security for enterprises is nothing less than supply chain security. Do enterprises look at routing security as such? I'm not so sure, but it's really how you get to your digital external assets. So 85%, as I mentioned, they're edge networks, they're enterprise networks. And they can contribute to routing security, but in a slightly different way than, let's say, transit provider. First of all, they have to do their part. They have to clean up their side of the street. In routing security, it takes two to tango, at least, because it's you implementing some of the things and your connectivity provider doing something for you. I mentioned routing information. If enterprise network doesn't record this routing information correctly in IRR or RPKI, the connectivity provider will not be able to effectively provide filtering mechanisms for their announcements. So that's one of the examples where enterprises have to do their part of the job. But the second thing that enterprises, if they really look at this from this kind of supply chain security concept, they would really demand certain controls, certain compliance in routing security sense from their connectivity providers. So my question is, how many of you are working for enterprises? How many of you, when sort of looking at the sort of security, holistic security assessment, look at your connectivity providers that do your internet access from routing security point of view? Do you include this in your analysis? Well, some of you do. That's a very good thing. So if we can really stimulate, if we can raise awareness, because my experience when I talk to enterprises is that level of awareness of routing security is low. And that partly maybe comes from the fact that, well, the internet is like an ocean. How can I? It's like boiling the ocean, securing your presence in the internet. But I hope I demonstrated in my presentation that's not necessarily the case. So raising this awareness and creating demand, it kills two birds with one stone. First of all, it leads to better connectivity for enterprises themselves. And second, it creates a better business, stronger business case for connectivity providers to get their backyard in order and implement routing security controls. So it's really a win-win situation. And you don't want your connectivity provider to be your weakest link. So I talked about MANRS, but to address that particular thing, we created another effort, which is called MANRS Plus. And when I say we, and in general when I talk about MANRS, it's not the Global Cyber Alliance, which is just secretariat that coordinates this function, but it's the community. It's the MANRS community and MANRS participants that do the actual work. So this is a framework for routing security that is done in the context of supply chain security. It really focuses on the demand of enterprise customers. If MANRS, when we developed MANRS programs, we're looking at the internet, this blue blob that I showed on one of the slides. This one is really focusing on this customer-provider relationship. And it's conditioned to be included in common InfoSec cybersecurity frameworks, because that's how CISOs work, right? They work with the framework, with checklist, and if routing security is not there, it will be omitted. Now, when we looked what really customers need, enterprise customers need from their connectivity provider, we conducted a survey. So I think about a couple of dozen enterprises participate in this survey, and those are the results. So we asked different questions, whether routing security is important, where DDoS protection is important, anti-spoofing, to what extent that they consider important if their connectivity provider implements something like this. Now, routing information, how important they consider that. Communication that relates to MANRS norm, like how easy it is to reach the support center to knock off their connectivity provider. Supply chain transparency, how important for them that they know what networks traffic traverses from their network to the external digital asset destination. And some security services. I mean, there were some examples of security services, such as helping with secure configurations or helping with registering some routing information, RPKI, for instance, this kind of stuff. So you can see, and the survey was sort of, on one hand, it was supporting our assumptions that those controls are important for customers. But on another side, it was slightly confusing with the experience we had, because enterprise said that, yes, it has fairly important, from fairly important to high business value, but we don't feel this in the sort of real life. So I don't know how. I would be interested to hear your views on this from your enterprise perspective, whether this corresponds to your feeling how you access those things. But nevertheless, that gave us some idea what kind of controls connectivity providers should promote, should introduce to be attractive to their customers. And as you see, we looked at different industry sectors like transportation, technology, education, and finance. So long story short, we create what is called sort of MANRS control metrics. And that contains 6 areas with several controls each. It might resemble MANRS because that was the baseline where we started, but it's much higher. It also has higher audit requirements, how an auditor can audit and really validate that those claims, that those controls are implemented, are really valid, in place. So routing security, there are 7 controls, very detailed controls. There will be a link in this presentation, so you can look at this metrics in more detail. It's a very detailed metrics. It also has audit requirements, how we can verify that those controls are really implemented. DDoS attack mitigation. This is not in MANRS, but for enterprise customers, DDoS mitigation was one of the very important requirements. So this is not about the service, that's about capability. If your connectivity provider has a capability to detect this unwanted traffic, detect volumetric attacks, and has facilities to mitigate them, it's not about the service offering that's between you and connectivity provider, but about the capabilities that connectivity provider has. So that's very important when you, for instance, doing tender or sending RFPs, if you include those requirements in there. Anti-spoofing protection, well, that's again same as MANRS. Routing info, I mentioned that, global communication, and security services. And I mentioned this a little bit. It was considered very important that for some of the enterprise that don't have resources and much expertise in networking per se, they might benefit from some of the services such secure configurations, templates from their connectivity provider. Now, in MANRS, we do work by working groups. Well, similar like here, we have SIGs, and in MANRS, we have working groups, a group of people, individuals, experts coming together and trying to resolve that issue. So the working group has been working for more than, I think, roughly 2 years now, and the outcome is the controls metrics that I mentioned. So this is a link to controls metrics. That's the control metrics. I'm not expecting you can read this small font, but if you download it, you can have a look at what is specified there. We also did a self-assessment survey. This is a survey. It's also available on our website. That's the survey for connectivity providers that aspire to become a MANRS Plus certified. To what extent they can, to what extent they implement the requirements of the control metrics, to what extent they can implement these requirements, and whether they can prove this with documentation or with external auditing framework. Sorry. Now, as I said, in MANRS, and especially in MANRS Plus, those claims or compliance claims are validated. And to scale up, we can't afford on-site auditing. It may be done. I mean, the metrics is there, and if some auditing companies are interested in integrating that in their either internal or external audit, that's their choice. But in general, we would like to automate auditing as much as possible and make it continuous. So every time, not once a year, not once a month, but you can know every day where your connectivity provider stands with regards to those controls. One of the things that is very challenging is measuring some things from the outside. And one of the crucial action is filtering. It's very difficult to measure. What we do now, we measure this by if a network is implicated in a routing incident, that means their routing controls are not in place. But that's a measure of non-compliance. You can't really validate compliance. So for this, we are planning to build an extended measurement framework, more active measurement framework, where we can actively test the efficacy of the filtering mechanisms of connectivity provider. There is a work with SIDN Labs ongoing. They're developing a prototype for this project. So, and this is a rough architecture where sort of MANRS measurement infrastructure can inject correct and incorrect announcements and see how the connectivity provider responds to them. We are planning now, we are talking to big connectivity providers that serve enterprise and big sectors to participate in self-assessment and a more in-depth audit just to test how resource consuming it is. And we also working on raising awareness from the customer side. There's even an idea to create in MANRS a separate program called Enterprise Program for MANRS. And that enterprise program will really focus on what enterprise need to do to facilitate routing security, including what requirements they should put for their connectivity providers. So that's another way of validating control metrics that MANRS Plus working group has created and raise awareness and demand. So if you're interested in this, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to discuss this further with you. And I think that's the end of my slides. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions. And if I'm here the whole week, so I'm especially interested in people with enterprise experience. Please find me in the hallways and talk to me. Oh, there's a question. Thank you.
We do have time for a question, I hope. Is there, like, with SSL Labs, there was this nice website where you could check the compliance of websites for SSL certificate security checks. Is there something similar for MANRS?
For MANRS, we have a tool called MANRS Observatory. Right. So you can go, there's observatory@manrs.org. It's on one of the slides. And you can see sort of MANRS conformance of, the thing is, for MANRS participants, it's open. They can look at different networks, right? For public, you can look on the country level, on the region level, this kind of stuff. But we also publish the score of MANRS participants on the MANRS main website. So you can go to the MANRS website and you see all the scores, how they perform as far as MANRS is concerned.
Right.
So
the reason is, like, if I'm in a large enterprise and I want to, like, buy upstream from, I don't know what, level 3, whatever, then I might be inclined to go and check, the vendor without being a member of MANRS myself. So this is sort of, this turns the incentives, right? So I don't know if that's possible, but I think that would be a big game changer.
Yeah, well, that we might discuss this in the community and open this up. That's one thing. As I said, if you're looking for MANRS participant, you can already check that, and good names are on this list. But I understand you might sort of have a random provider that would like to check. So yes.
Without myself being a MANRS member.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah, like, yeah,
I understand that.
Puts pressure.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much, and hope to meet you in the hallways this week. Thank you.